The wind that morning carried the smell of salt and smoke. Across the Trave River a gray mist hung low, swallowing the edges of the world. The bridge at Lubeck, a narrow span of cold steel and broken cobblestones, stood empty at dawn, except for two lines of men facing each other in silence. On one side, British soldiers, their uniforms faded, rifles slung, helmets dull with frost. Behind them, trucks idled softly, exhaust rising like ghosts. On the other, German guards, hollow-eyed, trembling beneath coats that no longer fit, the red swastika armband hanging loose on a dying arm. Between them, the bridge, the river, and the war's last breath. The year was 1945. Europe was ending. The exchange was supposed to be routine, prisoners of war for prisoners of war. But nothing about that day would feel routine. When the first man stepped forward, a British paratrooper who'd spent 3 years behind barbed wire, he paused at the bridge's center and looked into the eyes of the German officer waiting there. No hatred, no words, just two soldiers staring at each other, both too tired to pretend the war still meant anything. The wind shifted. Somewhere behind them, artillery thundered one last time, distant and fading. Then the first hand extended, trembling, human, real, and in that single handshake, witnessed by hundreds, the silence of an entire continent fell upon them. The war was ending, but what they saw on that bridge would never leave them. The spring of 1945 brought a strange quiet to northern Germany, not peace but exhaustion. The Reich was collapsing, the Western Allies advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east and in between, the shattered remains of an army that no longer believed in its own orders. The city of Lubeck, once a proud Hanseatic port, had become a refugee haven, streets choked with civilians, wounded soldiers and displaced prisoners. The spires that had survived centuries of storms now watched over a sea of ruins. And on the banks of the Trave River, British intelligence officers from the Second Army met with representatives of the German command under a white flag. The purpose: to arrange one of the last prisoner-of-war exchanges of the European conflict. The British had captured thousands of Germans across northern Holland and Denmark, including several officers from the 6th Parachute Division. In return, the Germans still held dozens of Allied prisoners, paratroopers, airmen, commandos, taken during the Arnhem and Normandy operations. But the exchange wasn't simply mercy, it was calculation. Both sides wanted information. For the British, the names and fates of airmen rumored to be transferred to camps near Lubeck. For the Germans, a chance to negotiate safe passage for civilians fleeing the east, away from the Soviets. The meeting point chosen was symbolic: the Trave Bridge, the last unbombed crossing still standing in the region. Its span had been repaired hastily after an air raid, its girders warped by heat, its stone piers black with soot. Beneath it flowed a river thick with debris, logs, corpses, and the oil sheen of a dying empire. Captain James Henshaw, British liaison from the Parachute Regiment, arrived at dawn with a small convoy. He had been at Arnhem 7 months earlier and carried the limp in his right leg to prove it. To him, the war had ended the moment he crawled from the burning wreckage of his glider. Everything since had been an echo. Beside him sat Sergeant Tom Avery, a wiry man from Manchester who hadn't smiled since 1942. He looked out at the bridge and muttered, "So this is it then." The end. Henshaw didn't answer. The end, he thought, had come too slowly to matter. Across the river, German Major Karl-Heinz Bergmann waited with a small detachment of guards. Once a schoolteacher from Hamburg, Bergmann had commanded a prisoner transport company since '43. His men were mostly conscripts, boys and old men pulled from the Volkssturm. None of them wanted to be there. In his pocket, Bergmann carried a letter from his wife written 2 weeks earlier before the Allied bombers reached their district. The last line read, "If the war ends, come home with clean hands." He hadn't opened it since. At 700, both sides approached the bridge from opposite banks. The fog was so thick it blurred the lines between friend and enemy. When the first figures appeared from the mist, weapons lowered, time seemed to hold its breath. The British moved first. 10 soldiers escorted 5 German prisoners to the bridge center, while the Germans led 5 Allied POWs from the opposite side. The steps echoed hollowly on the steel plates, clack-clack, until they met halfway. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the river below, slapping gently against the pylons. One of the returning British prisoners, Lieutenant Edward Miller, RAF, looked gaunt and colorless, his uniform hanging loose. He had been shot down over Bremen in '43 and survived 2 years in Stalag Luftwaffe. When he saw the British flag again through the mist, he stopped walking. His eyes filled, but no tears came. Henshaw stepped forward. "You're home now, son." Miller looked at him and whispered, "Home? Where's that?" Behind them, the Germans released their captives and received their own men in silence. There were no cheers, no salutes, only a strange, fragile stillness, as though both sides understood they were exchanging more than prisoners. They were trading ghosts. On the northern bank, medics tended to the returned British men, feeding them broth, wrapping them in blankets. Nearby, the German guards stood smoking cigarettes, glancing uneasily toward their officers. None dared cross back over until ordered. A dog barked somewhere in the ruins. Then distant, so faint it seemed unreal, came the sound of church bells. The war was dying, but not yet dead. Later that morning, Captain Henshaw and Major Bergman met face to face for the first time. They spoke briefly, stiffly, exchanging documents and confirming numbers. Their eyes, though, betrayed everything: exhaustion, loss, shame, relief. When it was over, Henshaw extended his hand. Bergman hesitated, then took it. The cameras from a nearby British correspondent captured the moment: 2 soldiers on a bridge shaking hands while the world burned behind them. The image would appear in newspapers across Europe weeks later under the headline, "The war's quietest victory." But the men in that photograph would never forget what came next. As the last prisoners were led away, a young German private approached his commander. He was shaking, his helmet too large for his head. "Herr Mayer," he whispered, "they say the Soviets are only 20 kilometers away." Bergman said nothing. He looked at the river, then at the bridge. "Then this," he said quietly, "is the last thing we will ever do for Germany." He ordered his men to destroy the crossing once the exchange was complete, not out of defiance, but to keep others from dying on it. That afternoon, charges were set along the bridge supports. The last of the British convoy had already departed toward Lubeck proper, the rescued POWs sleeping in the back of trucks. When Bergman gave the order, the explosion was small, a muffled boom that rolled down the valley. The bridge sagged, twisted, and fell into the trave with a hiss of steam and smoke. By evening, there was nothing left but the mist. In London, the story of the Lubeck exchange was buried among larger headlines: Hitler dead, Berlin fallen, Germany surrendered. Yet for those who had stood on that bridge, the memory remained sharper than any battle, not of victory, but of recognition. For a brief instant, 2 enemies had looked across the ruins of the world and seen themselves. The bridge was gone, swallowed by the trave. What remained were fragments, twisted steel, drifting timbers, and the memory of silence. Yet even as the water closed over the wreckage, the war beyond Lubeck was still devouring itself. Germany was dying in pieces. In the east, the Soviet Second Belarusian Front had reached the Baltic, cutting off entire German armies along the coast. To the west, British armored columns rolled through Schleswig-Holstein, taking surrender after surrender. Their progress slowed not by resistance but by refugees, endless rivers of civilians fleeing what they feared more than defeat: the Red Army. And in between those tides of history, in the ruins of Lubeck, men like Captain James Henshaw and Major Karl-Heinz Bergmann were left to deal with the debris of humanity. The aftermath of the exchange for Henshaw and his unit, the prisoner exchange at the Trave Bridge, became a brief flicker of sanity amid madness. But sanity had no place left in Germany. Within hours of the detonation that dropped the bridge, new refugees began pouring into Lubeck, thousands of them. Columns of civilians pushing handcarts, dragging children, some barefoot, some half-dead from the road. The city's streets were choked with wagons and bicycles, with wounded soldiers who no longer had units to return to. The British patrols who had just rescued their POWs now found themselves herding families away from the docks, their rifles raised not in anger but confusion. Henshaw wrote in his field log that night, "We came here to bring men home. Instead, we've inherited the world they ran from." On the other side of the river, Major Bergmann's detachment had not yet disbanded. Word reached them that Hitler was dead, Suicide in Berlin confirmed by radio from Flensburg. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the younger soldiers laughed, a dry, broken laugh that ended in tears. Bergman stood apart, watching the sky. The smoke from Lubeck's ruins drifted eastward toward the dawn. He thought of his wife's letter again. Come home with clean hands. But whose hands were clean now? He had seen the camps, the trains, the orders stamped with eagle seals and written in bloodless bureaucratic script. He had obeyed, as soldiers were meant to obey. But after the handshake on that bridge, something inside him no longer aligned with the Reich. He ordered his men to burn their armbands. They did so without a word. The arrival of the Soviets by May the 2nd, the horizon itself seemed to burn. The sound of artillery came rolling like distant thunder. Not British guns this time, but Soviet. Their vanguard had reached Wismar, less than 30 kilometers away. The Red Army's approach was not subtle. Columns of tanks and trucks rolled through fields littered with the wreckage of retreat. Villages fell in minutes, not through battle but surrender. Every German who could still walk ran west toward the British lines, desperate to cross before the Soviets arrived. That night, a storm hit the coast, rain lashing the ruins, lightning flashing over the river where the bridge had stood. In the chaos, hundreds of civilians stumbled into British checkpoints shouting the same words, "Please, or we are not Nazis. Let us cross." Among them were old soldiers in torn uniforms, their insignia ripped off, their eyes hollow. Some carried their wounded comrades on doors and wagon boards. Others carried children not their own. For the British, it was a nightmare of mercy, a tide of desperation that could not be turned away. Captain Henshaw stood under the dripping canopy of a truck, cigarette unlit, watching the endless procession. Sergeant Avery approached with a clipboard soaked through by the rain. "We've run out of food, sir. And blankets. They just keep coming." Henshaw nodded. "They're not our prisoners anymore," he said. "They're just people." He stepped out into the downpour, moving among the crowds, trying to separate soldiers from civilians. The rain made everyone look the same, faces blurred under water and mud. Children clung to mothers who were barely standing. Somewhere near the checkpoint, a group of German medics had set up an improvised shelter. Their Red Cross armbands turned brown with filth. One of them recognized Henshaw from the exchange. It was Bergman. The meeting again. Bergman approached without a salute. His uniform was gone, replaced by a gray civilian coat. In his hand he carried a small ledger, the list of names from his prisoner company. Men lost or accounted for. Henshaw looked at him through the rain. "I thought you were gone." "I thought I'd be dead," Bergman answered. They spoke quietly amid the chaos. Two officers with no war left to fight. Henshaw asked if Bergman intended to surrender formally. The German nodded. "To you, yes. Not to them." He meant the Soviets. Behind them, refugees continued to pour across the fields, the sky flickering red with distant fires. For a moment, both men stood in silence, the British captain and the German major, two survivors of a world that had burned itself out. Then Bergman handed him the ledger. "These are the names of every Allied prisoner I ever guarded, where they were sent, what happened to them. Some survived, some did not, but the truth should not die with us." Henshaw took it. The pages were damp, the ink bleeding into the paper. He knew what it cost a man like Bergman to carry that book. "You'll come with me," he said quietly. "We'll see you treated fairly." Bergman shook his head. "There's no fair left, Captain. Only what we choose to remember." He turned and walked into the fog, disappearing among the refugees. Henshaw never saw him again. The price paid. By the next morning, the Soviets reached the riverbank opposite Lubeck. Red flags rose above their tanks, the sound of engines shaking the water. British and Soviet officers met near the ruined bridge, exchanging stiff handshakes and wary smiles. The line was drawn there, east and west, one river apart. In the weeks that followed, Lubeck became a frontier of two worlds. British order on one side, Soviet hunger on the other. The river was no longer just a border. It was history itself, dividing Europe in half. The British set up camps for the displaced, ration stations, and hospitals for the wounded. Among the dead found near the crossing was a German officer, drowned in the current. In his coat pocket was a letter, waterlogged but legible. It read, "To my wife, I could not come home clean, but I did not come home a monster." They buried him on the north bank with no name, only the date, May 3, 1945. Captain Henshaw remained in Lubeck through the summer overseeing repatriations. Each week brought new transports, skeletal Allied prisoners rescued from camps deeper east, men who blinked at sunlight as if it were a weapon. They would step off the trucks, salute weakly, and vanish into field hospitals. Every time he handed one a ration pack, he thought of the bridge and of the man who had burned his own armband. He never spoke of Bergman to anyone, but he kept the ledger, dried its pages by candlelight, and locked it inside his field case. Years later, it would surface in the Imperial War Museum, anonymous, unsigned. But historians would note that the handwriting matched that of a German officer listed as missing, presumed dead near Lubeck in 1945. By September, the leaves along the river had begun to turn, the camps emptied, the roads cleared, and the city began to breathe again. Lubeck's churches rang with cautious bells, and Allied engineers built a new bridge across the Trave, a skeleton of steel rising over water that still remembered the explosions of spring. When it was finished, Henshaw walked across it alone. He paused at the center and looked down into the slow gray current. The reflection of the bridge shimmered, then broke apart. In the ripples, for an instant, he thought he saw faces, British and German, side by side, fading with the light. He took off his cap and whispered, "We were all prisoners in the end." The wind carried his words away, downriver, toward the sea. The river no longer smelled of war. It smelled of rot and rebirth. In the first days of peace, Lubeck's Trave River became something more than water. It was a wound running through history. One bank drenched in relief, the other in suspicion. On its western side flew the Union Jack, crisp and orderly. On the eastern, red banners with hammers and sickles rippled in the wind. Two armies had arrived at the same place at almost the same hour, and stopped only because the water told them to. The river became a mirror, Britain on one side, Russia on the other, both claiming victory, both staring into a reflection that neither could trust. The first contact on May 4, 1945, 2 days after Germany's formal surrender in the north, the British Second Army sent a patrol to the ruins of the Trave Bridge. They expected to find empty water. Instead, through the morning fog, they saw tanks on the far bank, low-slung T-34s painted with white stars and Cyrillic slogans. Soviet soldiers stood smoking by the turrets, watching silently across the river. A British lieutenant waved his helmet on a stick, a white rag tied to it. The Russians waved back, slowly, cautiously. Between them stretched only the gray current and the ghosts of the bridge that had once united the two sides. That afternoon, the first formal meeting took place on the muddy shoreline. British officers approached by boat, carrying tea in dented tins and cigarettes. Soviet officers came down the embankment carrying vodka and bread. They met in the middle of the shallow ford, the water lapping around their boots. The war was over, but their faces carried the same guarded tension as men still waiting for an ambush. Major Alexander Rybakov of the Soviet Third Guards Tank Corps offered a toast through an interpreter. To victory, comrades, to peace. Captain James Henshaw, his greatcoat heavy with rain, raised his tin cup and replied, "To the men who survived it." They drank, smiling with their mouths but not their eyes. The unspoken divide. In the days that followed, the river became a living checkpoint. British patrol boats drifted lazily on the western side while Soviet scouts prowled the eastern shore, their binoculars glinting in the pale sun. Refugees who had not crossed in time now found themselves trapped under new masters. Those who tried to swim were dragged from the water by British sentries, some alive, some not. "The war's over," one sergeant said bitterly, "and we're still catching the dead." Reports began to reach Henshaw's desk, Soviet units seizing German civilians as war labor, deporting them eastward. British detachments intercepting convoys of frightened villagers who whispered that the Red Army had come not as liberators, but as vengeance. Lubeck, once a medieval jewel, was now a border, one that would harden into something colder than war. The ledger every evening, Henshaw returned to the small requisitioned office near the docks, an old customs building with shattered windows covered by canvas. On his desk lay the ledger Bergman had given him before vanishing into the crowds. He had read it dozens of times, each name written in cramped, careful script. British airmen, French commandos, Polish prisoners, some followed by the word alive, others by a single dash. At the end of the list, in the final line, Bergman had written, "I cannot atone, but I can record." Henshaw stared at that line for hours some nights. He wondered whether Bergman was still alive somewhere beyond the river, perhaps already taken by the Soviets. He thought of that handshake on the bridge, the one that had meant everything and nothing, and realized that this was what remained of the war. A book of names, a record of ghosts, the refugee barges by June. The British had converted the Lubeck harbor into a processing hub. Barges loaded with displaced persons floated between the banks like ferries of the damned. Each carried hundreds of refugees, Germans, Poles, Czechs, Dutch, all claiming they had been prisoners once, all seeking passage west. The Soviet officers protested. "They are our citizens," Rybakov argued in broken English. "They belong in our territory now." But the British ignored the protests. Henshaw himself oversaw the loading of one such barge, his face expressionless as people pressed forward, clutching bundles of clothes, family photographs, a few still wearing concentration camp rags beneath their coats. As the vessel pushed off from the dock, an old woman reached out and caught Henshaw's sleeve. "Will the bridge be rebuilt, Captain?" He hesitated. "Someday." The woman nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Then maybe the world can cross it again." The barge drifted into the fog. The Soviets offer one evening, Rybakov requested another meeting. He arrived with 2 escorts, all wearing immaculate uniforms, their boots spotless despite the mud. Henshaw met them at the edge of the water. The Soviets offered a trade, information for prisoners. "We have 2 of your men," Rybakov said. "RAF, captured in Pomerania. We will return them, in exchange for 1 German officer hiding among your civilians. His name, Major Karl-Heinz Bergman." Henshaw's throat tightened. "You're mistaken," he said evenly. "We have no such man." Rybakov studied him, expression unreadable. "Then you are harboring war criminals. And you will learn, Captain, that mercy has a price." The Soviet officer turned and walked away, leaving muddy footprints that vanished into the mist. That night, Henshaw sat alone in his quarters, the ledger open on his lap. He stared at Bergman's name written across the first page. Outside, the sound of engines echoed, Soviet trucks crossing the far hills, moving eastward with their cargo of prisoners. The river between them felt wider than any ocean. The night of the dead bridge in late June, the British engineers began salvaging what they could of the destroyed bridge. Their floodlights lit the river in eerie halos, turning the black water into molten silver. Fishermen claimed they heard voices at night, whispers rising from the current, echoes of soldiers long drowned. Some swore they saw helmets drifting just beneath the surface, eyes glinting like glass. Henshaw dismissed the talk as nerves. But one night, while walking the bank alone, he thought he heard it too. Faint, almost human. A whisper carried by the current. "Remember us." He stopped, staring at the water. Beneath the reflections of the lamps, the twisted shadow of the bridge seemed to rise again, its skeletal frame shimmering under the moon. He closed the ledger and turned away. 2 sides of silence. By midsummer, Lubeck had settled into a strange rhythm. The city lived half in light, half in shadow. On the western side, British soldiers rebuilt roads, cleared rubble, reopened schools. On the eastern, Soviet patrols marched in rigid silence, their bayonets gleaming like cold stars. Sometimes, at dusk, you could see the 2 armies on opposite hills, identical silhouettes, identical postures, watching each other without moving. Between them, the river lay still, a mirror reflecting 2 worlds that had once fought together and would never again. The first rumors of an Iron Curtain began to spread that summer. No one yet understood what it meant, but they could feel it, in the way Soviet soldiers no longer waved across the water, in the way British sentries stopped talking to the refugees who lingered near the banks. The bridge had been destroyed only once, but the distance it created would last generations. The last name on August 12th, Henshaw received word that the War Crimes Unit in Hamburg was investigating missing Wehrmacht officers. Among the names listed, Major Karl-Heinz Bergman, unaccounted for, presumed escaped or deceased. That night, unable to sleep, Henshaw took a jeep and drove to the river. The fog was thick, the air cold. He parked near the ruins and climbed down to the edge, the sound of water murmuring below. From his coat, he pulled the ledger and opened to the final page. Then with a pencil, he added one last entry beneath Bergman's line. found peace in the river that divided the world. He tore the page free, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a tin box. With a single motion, he tossed it into the current. The river swallowed it without a sound. As dawn broke, light spilled over Lubeck, gold on rooftops, silver on the water. The mist began to lift, revealing both banks, both armies, both flags. For the first time since the war's end, the sky was clear. Captain Henshaw stood on the shore until the sun rose high enough to burn the fog away. Then he turned toward the city and walked back through streets filled with rebuilding, hammers, laughter, and life. Behind him, the river flowed quietly, carrying away everything that history no longer needed to keep. Summer faded from Lubeck like a dying ember. The air thickened with the smell of rust and salt, the sound of hammers rebuilding one world while another quietly hardened across the river. The war was over, but the ghosts it had birthed refused to sleep. At dawn, the city awoke to the distant blare of Soviet horns, a parade on the eastern bank, red banners flapping in the wind. On the western side, British troops formed their own ranks, saluting a flag that waved against a sky too tired for celebration. The Trav River ran between them, glimmering like polished steel, reflecting both empires in a single trembling image. Men called it peace. But the soldiers who stood watch knew better. It was a ceasefire with history itself. The new line by late August 1945, Lubeck had become a border garrison. Where there had once been refugees and convoys, there were now fences and watchtowers. Patrols from the British Second Army marched along the docks, while Soviet sentries manned the opposite bank, their rifles gleaming beneath the morning mist. It was an unspoken understanding. The river marked not just a physical boundary, but the beginning of something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. In the pubs of Lubeck, soldiers whispered a new phrase, the ghost front. There was no shooting here, no shells, no blood. Only eyes. Eyes watching from across the water day and night. And for Captain James Henshaw, that silence felt heavier than any battlefield. The ledger resurfaces. 2 months after he had cast Bergman's final entry into the river, a messenger arrived at Henshaw's billet carrying a sealed envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular, deliberate. Inside was a single folded page, damp but intact. It was the same one he had thrown into the Trav. Scrawled across the bottom in faint pencil were new words, written in German. I am still here. The river did not take me. No name, no return address, only those words, and beneath them a small cross drawn in ink. Henshaw stared at it for a long time. The handwriting, unsteady, formal, my man, was unmistakable. Bergman. The message had somehow crossed the border, through Soviet lines. Someone had delivered it, risking everything to do so. And that meant one thing. The ghosts beneath the flags were not content to rest. The man in the market in September, Lubeck's black market trade flourished. Cigarettes became currency. Tinned rations were gold, and anything that could be moved across the river fetched 10 times its worth. One evening, as rain began to fall, Henshaw walked through the crowded stalls near the docks, checking for contraband. That was when he saw him, or thought he did, a figure in a dark overcoat standing near a vendor's cart, head lowered beneath a cap. The man's posture, and the way he carried his shoulders, the measured slowness of his step, it was familiar. Too familiar. Henshaw pushed through the crowd, but by the time he reached the spot, the man was gone. Only a slip of paper remained on the vendor's table, caught beneath a wet loaf of bread. He pulled it free and unfolded it. Inside, in faint ink, the same cross. The rain washed the words away before he could read them fully, but one line remained clear: meet where we last spoke. Henshaw knew exactly where that was. The meeting at the river. The night was cold and sharp with wind when Henshaw reached the riverbank. He carried no weapon, only a flashlight and the old ledger tucked inside his coat. The moon shimmered on the water, revealing the faint outlines of Soviet watchlights across the far side. He waited. At first, there was nothing but the whisper of the current. Then, a movement in the fog. A figure emerged, limping slightly, one arm wrapped in a torn coat. The face, pale and worn, was unmistakable. Major Karl-Heinz Bergman. For a long moment, neither spoke. They stood there, 2 relics of a war that refused to end, with the ghost of the bridge between them. You should be dead, Henshaw said finally. Perhaps I am, Bergman replied, voice thin but steady. But I have one more truth to give. He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers bound with string. The last transport lists. Names the Soviets will bury if they find them. Allied and German, both. Henshaw took the bundle. Inside were rosters, handwritten manifests from the final weeks of the Reich, documenting evacuations from camps and prisons in the north. Men, women, children, most marked missing. Why bring this to me? Henshaw asked. Bergman looked at the water. Because you still believe mercy means something. They stood in silence, the river between them. On the far bank, a searchlight swung lazily through the fog. When it passed, Bergman stepped back into the shadows. If they find me, he said, they will call me a criminal. Perhaps they are right. But remember, not all monsters chose the mask they wore. Then he was gone. The interrogation. The next morning, British command intercepted Soviet intelligence requests. The Red Army had reported a fugitive officer, Major Bergman, Karl Heinz, suspected of desertion and espionage. They demanded cooperation. Henshaw filed a report claiming no knowledge of the man's whereabouts. But within days, Soviet officers arrived in Lubeck, questioning anyone who might have seen him. Rybakov himself led the inquiry. His tone was polite, his eyes not. He will hang, Rybakov said, and anyone protecting him will hang beside him. Henshaw said nothing. He simply handed over his logbook, the official one, empty, sanitized, safe. The real ledger lay hidden beneath the floorboards of his quarters. That night he dreamed of the bridge again. Not the real one, but a phantom bridge rising out of the mist, stretching endlessly into darkness. And on it, hundreds of faces, soldiers, prisoners, civilians, and walking without sound, each holding out their hands. When he tried to speak, they dissolved into smoke. He woke before dawn, trembling. The searchlights by October, tension along the river reached breaking point. Soviet searchlights swept the water every night, their beams cutting through the fog like blades. British sentries answered with flood lamps of their own, until the Trave glittered in alternating bands of white and red. It was no longer a bridge between allies. It was a stage for the coming Cold War. One night, a gunshot cracked through the darkness. Both sides froze. No one knew who fired. The next morning, they found a body tangled in the reeds. A fisherman, unarmed, shot clean through the chest. Neither army claimed responsibility. Neither lowered their lights. From that day onward, no one crossed the river again. The letter in December, as the first snow fell, Henshaw prepared to leave Lubeck. His orders were to return to England for reassignment. He spent his last night packing quietly, the room dimly lit by an oil lamp. As he folded his uniform, he noticed something wedged under the door, an envelope, old and crumpled. Inside was a final note written in German, unsigned. Do not let them forget what we tried to do. Attached was a single photograph, a grainy print of two men standing on a bridge in the fog, shaking hands. The image had been taken that morning months ago, before the world split in two. Henshaw stared at it until the lamp burned out. The next day, as his truck rolled away from Lubeck, he looked back at the river one last time. The fog was lifting, sunlight glinting on the frozen water. Somewhere beneath that ice lay the remains of the bridge, and perhaps the truth, waiting for spring. He touched the pocket where he'd placed Bergman's papers. I won't forget, he whispered. The truck disappeared down the road, leaving only the cold wind and the echo of marching boots fading into the distance. Time, like the river, does not stop. It only learns to flow around what it cannot forget. 30 years had passed since the exchange on the bridge at Lubeck. Yet every spring the mist returned to the Trave with the same cold patience, curling through the streets as if searching for the men who once stood upon its banks. The war had ended, the borders had hardened, the world had changed, but the ghosts remained. Echoes of the past. It was 1975 when a letter arrived at the Imperial War Museum in London. The envelope was yellowed, the ink faded, postmarked from Hamburg. Inside were two objects, a small tin box encrusted with rust and a note written in careful English. To whomever finds this, these belong to the river. But the river forgets. Curators pried open the box and found a water-stained page from a military ledger, its handwriting sharp and disciplined. The signature at the bottom was faint but legible. K.H. Bergman. Beneath it, one sentence had survived the decades. We were enemies only because we were told to be. For historians, it was an artifact. For those who had lived through the war, it was a wound reopened. The museum launched an investigation to verify its authenticity. And the trail, inevitably, led back to Captain James Henshaw, long retired, living quietly in Devon, his uniform folded away in a chest he had not opened in years. Henshaw's silence. When the young curator arrived at his doorstep, she found him tending a small garden overlooking the sea. His hair was white, his posture straight despite the years. When she mentioned the ledger, his hands froze on the handle of his spade. "You found it," he said softly. "I thought the river would keep it." Inside his cottage, he opened a drawer and removed an envelope identical to the museum's. Same handwriting, same seal. From it, he drew the photograph. Two men on a fog-shrouded bridge, one British, one German, hands clasped in the middle. "That's me," he said. "And that's Bergman." "The man history buried twice," the curator asked what happened to him. Henshaw stared through the window at the gray sea. "He crossed once too often," he murmured, "and one day the river decided to take him." But his voice held uncertainty, not conviction. Part of him still believed the major had lived, somewhere east of the line, under another name, another uniform, watching the river from the other side. The archive months later, the museum opened a new exhibition, Bridges of 1945, Allies and Enemies. In one corner, inside a glass case, lay the recovered ledger page beside the photograph. Visitors paused before it, drawn not by its historical importance but by its quiet humanity. The accompanying plaque read, "Recovered from the Trave River, 1975. Believed to document one of the final prisoner exchanges of World War II. Identity of the German officer unknown." But Henshaw knew, and though he never corrected the inscription, he visited the display once, standing before it as rain streaked the museum windows. In the reflection, for a fleeting instant, he thought he saw another face beside his, stern, watchful. Faintly smiling, he whispered under his breath, "You kept your promise." The river revisited in the spring of 1978. He returned to Lubeck for the first time since the war. The city was rebuilt. The river spanned again by new bridges of concrete and steel. The old crossing site was marked by a small plaque half hidden by moss. Here in 1945, soldiers of opposing armies met in peace. He stood there for a long while, the air filled with gulls and distant church bells. The Trave flowed calmly beneath him, the water darker than he remembered, but quieter too, as if it had finally grown tired of keeping secrets. A local historian accompanied him, pointing to the opposite bank where Soviet-era warehouses still stood abandoned. "They say sometimes, 'At dawn you can hear footsteps on the water,'" she said with a faint smile. "Old soldiers crossing back to finish their conversation." Henshaw smiled too, though his eyes were wet. "If you listen closely, they were never arguing," he said. "Just remembering." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small brass badge, the parachute regiment's wings, and let it fall into the current. It sank slowly, spinning, until it vanished in the green depths. The discovery 5 years later, construction workers dredging the eastern bank uncovered a corroded metal box wedged between stones. Inside were waterlogged papers, fragments of cloth, and a pocket watch stopped at 0413. The name etched on the back, K.H. Bergman. No one could say how long it had been there, or how it came to rest precisely where the old bridge once touched land. Some believed he had tried to cross again and drowned. Others insisted he had survived and returned years later to leave behind what remained of himself. The museum catalogued the find and placed it beside the earlier artifacts. But those who handled the watch swore that when they held it close, they could still hear a faint ticking, like a heartbeat refusing to surrender. The memory of hands by, the 1980s, the world had changed again. The Cold War's frost had thickened. New walls had risen where rivers once divided. But veterans who remembered the war's end would sometimes gather and speak of the strange day when enemies had met, halfway across a bridge and found something like peace. They would describe the smell of wet steel, the sound of boots on cobblestone, the feel of a handshake that meant survival more than victory. And when they did, the room would fall silent, each man seeing in his mind the same image. Two hands clasped in the fog while the rest of the world dissolved behind them. For them, it was not a story of triumph. It was a memory of mercy, brief, fragile, human. The last visit Captain Henshaw died in 1984. He was buried overlooking the sea, his service record modest, his medals few. At his funeral, a sealed envelope was placed on the coffin. It contained only a photograph and a note written in careful German script. "The river remembers us both. No one ever learned who sent it." Some said it arrived from the east. Some said from no address at all. Years later, when historians pieced together the fragments of Lubeck's story, they found that every bridge the city rebuilt after the war had a small inscription on one of its cornerstones. 3 words carved in quiet defiance of time. "Do not forget." Epilogue today, visitors walking along the Trave can still see the faint outline of the old foundations under the water when the tide is low. Fishermen say that on certain mornings when the mist hangs just right, the air carries a sound like footsteps on steel. The locals call it Die Brücke der Stimmen, the bridge of voices. They say if you stand there in silence long enough, you'll hear them, the march of boots fading into the fog, the low murmur of men who have nothing left to fight for, only stories left to tell. And if you listen closely between the echoes, you might still hear the final words of a British captain and a German major who once met in the middle of a broken world. "We were enemies only because we were told to be." Then the river swallows the sound, carrying it out to the Baltic, into the gray horizon where all wars end and all ghosts find peace.